Welcome to our discussion about Mark Twain and the notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County, which is perhaps his most popular short story. This particular story is an example of realism, but more specifically, it's Southwest humor. So, characteristics of Southwest humor and things that you'll see within this text, first of all, is dialect, okay? So, all characters in Southwest humor have a dialect. And if you are from the South in the United States, you understand that we have a certain accent. If you're from the North and you came down South, it may sound a little funny to you. Or if you're from the American South and you go up North, they may not understand you as much in terms of how you speak just because of the dialect that we have here. So the best example, which may seem a little cheesy to give you for a Southwest humor story, is actually a picture frame, okay? So this story, a Southwest humor story, sort of works like a photo frame. You will have this outside, and that is your educated narrator. So that's what you've got going on here. You'll always have an educated narrator, usually someone who's an outsider, someone who's sort of cut off from the town that's being discussed or the people being discussed, and they sort of work to border this story, okay? And then on the inside, you're going to have the story itself, okay? So the best examples to give you is a framed sort of narrative, and that's usually what a Southwest humor story is. So your characters will have dialect. You'll usually have a very educated, distant narrator. Usually, Southwest humor stories are marked with exaggeration, boasting. There are often these clever stories of these characters who are very clever, who are deceptive, and sometimes there will be a sort of twist. Sometimes the trickster will be tricked at the end, okay? Also, they sort of have this tall tale quality. And when we're thinking tall tale, you may be familiar with Paul Bunyan and some of the characters from these sort of tall tales who lived a larger than life, lifestyle. They were talked up by, cowboys and different people who would sit around campfires and make up all of these stories. So Paul Bunyan, who had this massive ox and all of his men, it took him, days, if not a whole week, to butter the pancakes because the pancakes were so large. So these stories that are sort of exaggerated, they all sort of have this tall tale quality to them. Okay. Usually, there will be the presence or the presence of practical jokes, swindlers, sports competition, cons. So in this story, we have, or in the Notorious Jumping Frog, we do have a sports competition, and we have a guy who's sort of a con artist, and a practical joke. And in this case, we have the trickster, so Smiley, who ends up being tricked at the end of this. And again, finally, the last characteristic, as we've said, is the educated narrator. Okay, so if you are following along in the Norton Anthology, the Notorious Jumping Frog begins on page 115. If not, that's fine. I'm just going to pick out a few passages and some things that you may want to look at as you read through this, okay? So page 116 of the text, again, we have this framed narrative from an educated narrator, and we are being told this story by, it's about Smiley or Jim Smiley, but it's all being told to us from our narrator, and the narrator is getting this story from Simon Wheeler. So it's sort of a Simon Wheeler got this story. Simon Wheeler is telling the story to our narrator, and this whole story is really about this character named Leonidas Smiley, who sort of has a gambling issue, okay? So to tell you how in-depth his gambling issue is, 116 of your text, at the bottom of this fairly long paragraph, It said, it made no difference to him. We're talking about Smiley. He'd bet on anything. The dangest fellow. Parson Walker's wife lay very sick for a while, and it seemed as if it weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better. Thank the Lord for his infinite mercy and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, I'll risk 2.5 she don't. So he kind of has a gambling issue to the point that he'll bet on whether or not a parson or a pastor's wife will survive, okay? So he not only bets on that, but we see him betting on a horse. He also has a dog. And he sort of has these literal underdog characters that he finds and uses in all of his betting. So there are elements of humor to this. In the horse, he talks about how slow the horse was. We see humor in the dog and also in the frog as well. The dog's name and the frog's name. So let's talk about that. So first of all, he has this dog that he names Andrew Jackson. And he has a frog named Daniel Webster. And he names the dog, or the frog, Daniel Webster. And there's sort of a subtle meaning behind this. It could also be like sort of a political meaning. Andrew Jackson, he was a Westerner. So we're talking about, the Southwest, but Andrew Jackson was a Westerner. He was the 7th president of the United States. He was sort of this man of the people, believed in all, or democracy for all. And he kind of describes this dog as something that doesn't look like much, but is incredibly feisty. So it could be sort of a political message that Mark Twain is making about Andrew Jackson. He also talks about Daniel Webster. So Daniel Webster, you may associate his name with the dictionary, so Webster's Dictionary, but he actually ran for president 3 times. So he ran unsuccessfully for president. So there was never a President Webster in American history. But he was very, very educated. And so it could sort of be and keep in mind he was also an attorney. He was also an attorney, but he was very educated, and so it could be that this, educated frog was only, was beaten by this common uneducated frog by cheating. So I don't know, but there are scholars who think that there are sort of political statements behind the meaning of those names, okay? So we have Smiley, and we're talking about some of his past dealings in gambling, and he finds this frog. He decides to train the frog, and he is so convinced that this frog can jump any frog that could, that he would win. But it takes a stranger or a person from the outside to come in and kind of show him up. So on page 118 of the text, top of this page, he says, the beginning of this paragraph begins with, well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day, a fellow, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with the box and says, what might it be that you've got in this box? So he asks Smiley, and of course Smiley's first reaction is, here's someone that doesn't know this, and I can gamble with him, so make a little money on the side. So they risk $40 on this, so they've got a $40 bet, which at that time was a significant amount of money, okay? And so while Smiley, goes down to the swamp to fetch this guy a frog, this guy fills Smiley's frog with gunshot. And so his frog, it obviously weighs him down. And so we have this trickster being tricked here. So at the end of this, we come back kind of full circle back to our narrator. So we have that uneducated narrator, and we have come back full circle to him. And we wrap up with on page 119. However, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave. Okay? So we've come back, we've begun with the educated narrator, we've listened to the story, and we've come back full circle to the educated narrator, okay? So keep in mind these characteristics of Southwest humor, and I hope you've enjoyed this and that you explore more text by Mark Twain.